In the grim darkness of the far future, there exist horrors beyond mortal comprehension. Among these countless terrors, few are as deeply personal, as intimately cruel, as what occurs when the green-skinned Xenos known as Orks get their crude, brutal hands on the sacred war machines of the Adeptus Astartes. Today, we explore one of the darkest fates that can befall a space marine. Not death in glorious combat, not even capture and torture by the forces of chaos, but something perhaps worse. The desecration, the violation, the transformation of one of the Ultramarines' most revered warriors, entombed within his Dreadnought sarcophagus, as Ork mechboys tear apart everything he once was and rebuild it into something grotesque. This is the story of what happens when Orks capture an Ultramarines Dreadnought on the worlds of Ultramar. Before we descend into the specifics of this nightmare scenario, we must first understand the players in this tragedy. The Ultramarines. Chapter of the Adeptus Astartes stands as perhaps the most famous, most exemplary of all Space Marine chapters. Sons of the Primarch Robuta Guilliman, they are the ultimate expression of order, discipline, and tactical excellence. Their realm, Ultramar, is not merely a single fortress monastery world like most chapters claim, but an entire stellar empire. Once encompassing 500 worlds during the Great Crusade, even after the Horus heresy reduced their domain, Ultramar remains a shining beacon of imperial civilization in the eastern fringe. Within these carefully administered worlds, citizens live better lives than almost anywhere else in the Imperium. They know genuine justice, reasonable governance, and the protection of their superhuman guardians. The capital world of Macragge sits as the crown jewel of this realm, its towering mountains home to the Fortress of Hera, where the Ultramarines maintain their fortress monastery. Other worlds like Calth, with its vast underground cities built after the Wordbearers poisoned its sun during the heresy, Talassar with its violent seas, Espandor with its endless forests, and Ajax, the garden world of legendary fertility, each contribute to making Ultramar a functioning empire rather than merely a military installation. The Ultramarines take their duties as rulers seriously, viewing the governance of these worlds not as a burden, but as a sacred responsibility handed down by their Primarch through the Codex Astartes. Standing in stark contrast to this ordered, civilized realm are the Orks. Where the Ultramarines represent humanity's highest aspirations toward discipline and excellence, Orks represent something far more primal and terrifying in their own way. They are a plague upon the galaxy, a green tide that crashes against civilized worlds with the force of an apocalypse. Genetically engineered warriors created millions of years ago by the ancient Old Ones during the War in Heaven, Orks are living weapons that have outlived their creators and now exist for one purpose alone: war. They live to fight. They breed through spores released throughout their lives and especially at death, making them nearly impossible to truly eradicate from any world they've touched. They grow larger and stronger the more they fight, their physiology responding to success in battle by making them even more dangerous. But what makes Orks truly unique among the Xenos races is their relationship with technology and reality itself. Every Ork generates a low-level psychic field, and when thousands or millions of Orks gather together, these fields combine into the Gestalt phenomenon known as the WH. This psychic resonance doesn't just make Orks recognize which among them is biggest and therefore in charge. It actually warps reality in subtle but significant ways. Ork technology, which by all rights should not function, which consists of scrap metal hammered together with no regard for actual engineering principles, somehow works because the Orks believe it should work. The WH field fills in the gaps, makes the impossible possible, turns junk into functional weapons through sheer collective belief. Red vehicles go faster simply because Orks think they should. Guns fire when they shouldn't be able to. Armor protects when by rights it should collapse. Within Ork society, certain individuals called odd boys are born with specialized instincts. The mech boys, also called mechs, possess an innate genetic understanding of engineering and construction. They don't learn how to build things through education. The knowledge simply exists in their genes, placed there by the old ones countless ages ago. A mech can look at a pile of scrap and instinctively know what each piece is and how it could be used. Give them materials and tools, and they'll start building, creating ramshackle but surprisingly effective weapons and vehicles. The best and biggest mechs become big mechs, masters of Ork technology, who can create truly impressive and devastating war machines. Among the various Ork clans, none epitomize the looting mentality quite like the Death Skulls. Their entire culture revolves around the acquisition of other races' technology and equipment. They're the quintessential scavengers and thieves of Ork society, painting everything they own in blue because they believe blue is lucky, and covering their acquisitions in looted symbols and icons. But the truth is that all Orks loot. It's fundamental to how they operate. After every battle, Orks swarm across the battlefield, taking everything they can carry. Weapons, armor, ammunition, food, vehicles, even buildings get dismantled and carried off. Entire Ork warbands called looters specialize in grabbing the best weapons from dead enemies and getting mechs to rebuild them into shoulder-mounted gun platforms. Now imagine these two forces colliding. The ordered, disciplined Ultramarines defending their carefully maintained realm against the chaotic, barely organized but overwhelming tide of an Ork. Wow! Such conflicts have occurred throughout history. Espandor itself saw a brutal Ork invasion in the late 41st millennium, requiring the sacrifice of the Dreadnought Barcus to ensure the survival of the Ultramarines' forces. The world of Prandium, once considered the crowning glory of Ultramar for its natural beauty, was completely stripped bare by Tyranids, but Orks too have threatened these worlds countless times. When an Ork wag gains momentum, when the psychic field grows strong enough, Orks will pour forth from every corner of space, drawn to the promise of the best fighting, the biggest battles, the most glorious carnage. To understand the true horror of what we're about to discuss, we must first comprehend exactly what a dreadnought is, for it is far more than simply a weapon. It is a walking tomb. It is a prison. It is both salvation and damnation, wrapped in adamantium and ceramite. When a space marine suffers wounds so catastrophic that even the advanced medical capabilities of the chapter's apothecaries cannot save him, when his body is broken beyond repair, but some spark of life remains, the chapter faces a choice. They can grant him the Emperor's peace, a quick death, and the honor of having his gene seed harvested for the next generation. Or, if the warrior is deemed valuable enough, experienced enough, worthy enough, they can offer him a different fate. The process of interring a space marine into a dreadnought is part surgery, part religious ritual, and entirely irreversible. The dying marine's broken body is suspended in amniotic fluids within an armored sarcophagus, connected to life support systems that will sustain him indefinitely. What remains of his physical form, often little more than a torso and perhaps a head, becomes permanently wired into the dreadnought's systems through neural links and cybernetic interfaces. His senses are replaced by the machine's sensors. His limbs become weapons and power fists. His voice becomes a mechanical approximation filtered through Vox speakers. Everything that made him physically human is stripped away, leaving only consciousness trapped within a shell of metal. The Ultramarines, like all chapters, consider this interment a great honor. They tell their warriors that service will continue. They speak of how the Ancient Ones, as dreadnoughts are respectfully called, will guide future generations with their wisdom. They frame it as preservation of the chapter's greatest heroes, and in many ways, this is true. Dreadnoughts are revered. Their counsel is sought. Their presence on the battlefield inspires ordinary space marines to greater acts of heroism. When a dreadnought strides into combat, it brings the accumulated experience of centuries or even millennia. Some dreadnoughts remember the Horus Heresy itself, their memories extending back 10,000 years to the Imperium's darkest hour. But there is another side to this existence that goes unspoken in the grand ceremonies and solemn pronouncements. The pilots spend most of their time in a death-like sleep, their consciousness dimmed to preserve their sanity and extend the operational life of their biological components. When they wake, it is for war. They are roused from the darkness, their systems brought online, and they are immediately thrust into battle. There is no time for adjustment, no period of acclimatization. One moment, nothing. The next moment, sensors detecting enemy targets and tactical data streaming into their consciousness. They fight, they kill, and then they are returned to sleep. Years might pass between awakenings, decades, centuries. Each time they wake, more of their battle brothers are gone, replaced by warriors they've never met. Each time they wake, more of their humanity has eroded away, ground down by the mechanical existence they endure. The Ultramarines have always maintained strong bonds with their dreadnoughts. In a chapter that values tradition, tactical wisdom, and the teachings of the Codex Astartes, these ancient ones represent living links to their history. Dreadnought Barcus, before his destruction during the Ork invasion of Espandor, had served the 4th Company with distinction for unknown centuries. Brother Ultrasius of the 2nd Company was interred after the Pyra Crusades in the 39th Millennium and continued serving well into the 41st. Venerable dreadnoughts like Brother Agnathio survived the Battle of Calth itself, that apocalyptic betrayal during the Horus Heresy, and fought for 10,000 years afterward. Each of these warriors represents not just a weapon system, but a repository of knowledge, a teacher, a reminder of everything the chapter has endured and overcome. When an Ultramarine is placed in a dreadnought, his brothers do not forget him. His name is spoken with reverence. His deeds are remembered. The Tech Marines and Tech Marines maintain his sarcophagus with religious devotion, treating the war machine not merely as equipment, but as a shrine to a living saint. They paint it in the blue and gold of Ultramar. They adorn it with honor markings and campaign badges. They inscribe his name and his victories upon its armor. Everything about a dreadnought's appearance announces who pilots it, what they have achieved, and what they represent to the chapter. To desecrate such a machine is not merely to damage equipment. It is to violate something sacred. It is to defile the body and soul of a revered warrior who has already sacrificed everything for the Imperium. Now we must turn our attention to the darker aspects of Ork behavior, particularly their relationship with captured technology. Orks don't simply loot for practical reasons, though the acquisition of weapons and vehicles they couldn't otherwise build serves definite practical purposes. They loot because they fundamentally cannot resist the urge. When an Ork sees something interesting, something shiny, something that looks like it would be good for fighting, a deep compulsion overtakes them. They must have it. This isn't reasoned thought. It's closer to instinct, to genetic programming that drives them to acquire and adapt whatever they find. The mech boys experience this compulsion even more intensely. Where ordinary Orks might grab a gun or some armor, mech boys are drawn to complex technology. Vehicles especially fascinate them. Imperial tanks, Eldar gravcraft, Tau battlesuits, even Tyranid bioconstructs. All of these trigger the mech's engineering instincts. They'll spend hours, even days, taking apart a captured machine to understand how it works. Except they don't understand how it works, not really. Their genetic memory tells them what parts do, tells them how to connect things, but they don't comprehend the underlying principles. They operate on pure instinct, backed up by the psychic field of the Weigi, which makes their impossible contraptions function despite all logic. When Orks modify looted equipment, they follow certain patterns that reveal their priorities and aesthetic preferences. First, everything must be made more Orky. This means bigger, louder, and covered in crude modifications. They weld metal plates onto armor, not because the vehicle needs more protection, but because more metal makes it look tougher. They bolt on additional weapons, stacking guns on top of guns until the whole thing bristles with firepower. Doesn't matter if the aiming mechanisms are ruined. or if the added weight makes it nearly impossible to move. More guns equals more dakka, and more dakka is always better. They add spikes, chains, and jagged edges because these make the vehicle look mean. They paint everything, usually red for speed, but other colors have their own properties according to Ork belief. Blue is lucky, yellow makes explosions bigger, purple makes things sneaky because nobody has ever seen a purple orc. Black is tough and harder to kill. The process is violent, chaotic, and completely disrespectful of the original design. Mech boys don't carefully preserve functionality while adding their modifications. They tear off bits they don't understand or don't like. They weld new components directly onto critical systems. They rip out the original power source and jam in something that probably shouldn't work but does, because the WH40K field makes it work. Gretchen assistants, small goblinoid creatures that serve orcs as laborers and cannon fodder, swarm over the project, following barked orders from the mech, stealing parts from each other, occasionally getting crushed or incinerated when something goes wrong. The whole workshop echoes with the sounds of hammering, welding, shouting, and periodic explosions. For Imperial Guard vehicles, this process is relatively straightforward, if horrific to witness. A Lehman Russ tank, workhorse of the Imperial military, becomes a looted wagon. Out come the carefully calibrated targeting systems, replaced, with a crude gun mount that works through brute force and the WH40K field. Off comes the camouflage paint, replaced with garish red and yellow. On go the spikes, the rams, the additional armor plates. The original crew compartment gets modified to fit Ork physiology, which usually means tearing out seats and controls, since Orks don't need such luxuries. Within days or even hours, depending on how many mechs and grots are working, the tank no longer resembles its original form. It's still recognizable as having once been a Lehman Russ, but now it's something else, something crude, something that screams its new allegiance to anyone who sees it. But Space Marine equipment represents a different challenge entirely. Astartes wargear is not mass-produced like Imperial Guard equipment. Each piece is a work of craftsmanship, blessed by the Mechanicus, inscribed with prayers and purity seals. The materials alone are far superior to standard Imperial equipment. Ceramite armor, adamantium structural components, advanced power sources that have sustained war machines for thousands of years. The machine spirits that the Mechanicus believes inhabit all technology are particularly strong in Space Marine equipment. From an Ork perspective, this means the loot is even better. From a practical standpoint, it means the equipment is more resistant to their modifications, though this never stops them from trying. Space Marine vehicles rarely fall into Ork hands intact simply because Space Marines rarely lose battles so catastrophically that they abandon functioning equipment. When a Rhino transport or a Predator tank falls to enemy fire, the Space Marines typically recover it after the battle, or destroy it themselves if recovery proves impossible. The chapter simply cannot allow sacred wargear to be captured, but in the chaos of battle, especially against overwhelming numbers, even Space Marines can be forced into full retreat. Equipment gets left behind. Damaged vehicles that would normally be towed to safety are instead abandoned in the desperate need to preserve the chapter's most valuable resource, the Space Marines themselves. And when Orks overwhelm a Space Marine position, when the green tide finally crashes over defenses that have held for hours or days, they don't take prisoners and they don't show mercy. They kill and they loot, in that order, or sometimes simultaneously. Dreadnoughts occupy a special place in this grim calculus. When a Dreadnought falls in battle, it represents both an opportunity and a challenge for the Orks, though they lack the awareness to truly appreciate what they've captured. To them, it's a big walking weapon platform. It's got armor thicker than a tank. It's got guns that can blow holes in fortress walls. It can crush Orks with its power fist and shrug off shots that would destroy lighter vehicles. In short, it's exactly the kind of thing that triggers every looting instinct in the Ork psyche. The mech boys see it and immediately start thinking about what they could do with it. Make it shootier, make it choppier, paint it red so it goes faster, even though dreadnoughts don't actually go that fast. Add more guns, more armor, more spikes, more everything. What they don't understand, what they cannot understand because their minds don't work that way, is that a dreadnought isn't just a machine. There's someone inside, a living, conscious being trapped within that sarcophagus, kept alive by systems the Orks will blunder through with all the delicacy of an avalanche. They don't grasp the sacred nature of what they've captured, the centuries or millennia of service represented by the warrior inside, the bonds of brotherhood connecting him to his chapter. To them, it's just loot. Really good loot, but just loot. Now let us construct the scenario that leads to capture. Picture Espandor, that forested cardinal world on the edge of Ultramar's territory. Its two continents are covered in ancient trees, broken only by carefully planned cities that blend into the natural landscape according to Guilliman's principles of harmonious development. The population is smaller than the more developed core worlds of Ultramar, but they are proud people, descendants of explorers who settled here during the Age of Strife and have maintained their independence and unique culture even while embracing their place in Ultramar's order. The Orks arrived without warning, as they often do. Perhaps they were drawn by the psychic wake of a nearby weg that had ravaged other systems. Perhaps they were simply wandering warbands that stumbled upon Espandor and decided it looked like a good place for a fight. Perhaps a war boss had specifically targeted the world as part of a larger campaign against Ultramar. The reason doesn't particularly matter. What matters is that thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands of Orks descended upon Espandor in crude spacecraft and rock transports, massive asteroids, hollowed out and filled with Orks that were simply dropped from orbit to crater into the surface. The Ultramarines responded with their characteristic efficiency and tactical brilliance. The Fourth Company, perhaps led by a captain who had studied the Ork invasion scenarios detailed in the Codex Astartes, deployed to reinforce the planetary defense forces. With them came several ancient ones, dreadnoughts, whose experience with Ork combat stretched back centuries. Among them, let us imagine, was Brother Castus, a venerable dreadnought who had served the chapter for 600 years since his interment, after suffering catastrophic wounds fighting word-bearers during a border war in the galactic East. He had walked through the fires of a dozen campaigns. His assault cannon had spoken the Emperor's wrath to countless enemies. His power fist had crushed the skulls of alien war bosses and heretic commanders. He was, by any measure, a hero of the chapter. The initial battles went well. The Ultramarines struck at the Ork landing zones with precise drop pod assaults and lightning-fast attacks by assault marines. They targeted the biggest Orks, knowing that removing leadership would fracture the horde into infighting mobs. They used the terrain masterfully, turning the forests of Espandor into killing grounds where disciplined fire could cut down waves of Ork boys charging between the trees. Brother Castus's assault cannon became a focal point of many defenses, his withering fire creating fields of Ork corpses that slowed subsequent waves. The Ultramarines held their ground, adapted to Ork tactics, and fought with the skill that made them the exemplars of the Adeptus Astartes. But Orks have one advantage that even the Ultramarines struggle to counter: numbers. For every Ork that fell, it seemed like 3 more appeared. The WAG field grew stronger as more greenskins gathered on Espandor, drawn by the promise of the best fight in the sector. Battles that should have been victories became Pyrrhic struggles. Positions that should have held for days fell in hours. The Ultramarines never broke, never routed, never showed fear, but they were being ground down by attrition that even their superior skill and equipment couldn't fully offset. The Battle of Valorin Pass became the turning point. The Ultramarines had established a defensive line in a river valley, using the natural terrain to create overlapping fields of fire. The Orks, led by a particularly brutal war boss riding a Gargant, a towering war machine the size of an Imperial Titan, launched a massive assault. Thousands of boys charged forward, while Def Dreads and Killer Khans provided fire support. The sky darkened with Ork aircraft dropping bombs with typical accuracy, which is to say they hit friend and foe alike. Brother Castus stood in the center of the line, his assault cannon speaking a continuous roar of thunder, cutting down Orks by the score. The line held for 6 hours, then 8, then 12. Castus's ammunition reserves ran low, and his assault cannon fell silent, replaced entirely by his power fist as he waded into melee combat, crushing Orks with each sweep of his adamantium limb. Around him, battle brothers fought with chainswords and combat knives when their bolters ran dry. The dead piled so high that new Orks had to climb over corpses to reach the Ultramarines' position. But still they came. Always they came. When the Gargant finally reached the Ultramarine line, it simply walked through it. Mega cannons on its arms fired at point-blank range, blowing apart defensive positions that had withstood everything else. Its massive feet crushed battle brothers and Orks alike. Brother Castus turned to engage it, and for a moment, it seemed possible that even this monstrous war machine could be brought down. His power fist struck the Gargant's leg joint, tearing through meters of welded armor plate. Inside the Gargant, dozens of Orks panicked as their machine stumbled. But there were too many of them, and Gargants don't go down easily. The Gargant kicked. It wasn't sophisticated. It wasn't tactical. It was just a massive metal foot swinging at the thing that had hurt it. Brother Castus, despite 600 years of combat experience, despite superhuman reflexes enhanced by his connection to the Dreadnought systems, despite everything, couldn't dodge. The impact lifted his entire chassis off the ground and sent him crashing into the remains of a stone fortification 20 meters away. His armor cracked, his systems screamed warnings, his neural link flickered, and then the Orks were on him, dozens of them, stabbing and hacking and wrenching at his armor, trying to pull him apart. The last thing Brother Castus's external sensors recorded before they went dark was the Ultramarine line finally breaking, his brothers conducting a fighting withdrawal, leaving the dead and the critically damaged behind because staying meant dying for nothing. In his mind, through the pain and the system failures, he tried to cry out, "Don't leave me, brothers, please." But his Vox was offline, his weapons were offline, everything was offline. He felt the Orks dragging him, felt them hooking chains to his broken armor, felt them hauling him like a prize animal. And then, mercy of mercies, his consciousness faded into the emergency hibernation that occurs when a Dreadnought systems suffer catastrophic damage. Darkness claimed him, and for a time, there was nothing. When awareness returned, it came in fragments. First, sound. The crash and clang of metal on metal. Ork voices, guttural and loud, barking orders and insults in their crude tongue. The whir of power tools, the hiss of welding torches. Then, sensation. Not physical sensation, because he had no physical body to speak of anymore, but the data his remaining sensors provided. He was in a large space, hot, the air thick with smoke and oil. His chassis was stationary, held in place by crude but effective restraints. Then, vision. His optical sensors came partially online, providing grainy, flickering images. He could see. Emperor help him, he could see where he was. The workshop of an Ork mech boy. Scrap metal everywhere. Vehicles in various states of disassembly and reconstruction. Gretchen running between piles of parts, carrying tools and components, and around him, dozens of Orks. Some were working on him directly, others were just watching, pointing and laughing and shouting suggestions. And at the center of it all, a big mech, identifiable by his larger size and the wealth of mechanical augmentations covering his body. Brother Castus tried to access his systems, tried to activate weapons, tried to move, tried anything. Nothing responded. The Orks had been thorough in their initial assessment, disabling everything that could threaten them while they worked. He couldn't fight. He couldn't escape. He couldn't even speak to tell them what they had, what they were doing, though they wouldn't have understood or cared. He could only watch, only observe his own desecration with the detachment of his mechanical senses. The big mech circled Castus's chassis, examining it from every angle with an expression that might have been appreciation or might have been hunger. It was hard to tell with Orks. The greenskin reached out with a crude mechanical claw that replaced one of his hands and tapped the sarcophagus housing Castus's body. The sound reverberated through Castus's audio sensors. Then the mech started barking orders. The Gretchens swarmed forward with tools. The work began. They started with the iconography, the Ultramarine symbols, the Ultramar, the proud blue and gold livery. All of it had to go in the Ork aesthetic. Grots with sanders and grinders assaulted his armor, removing paint in harsh strokes that left scratches in the ceramite beneath. Others followed with brushes and buckets of paint, slapping on colors with no technique or care. Red dominated because red goes faster, though Castus's Dreadnought chassis had never been designed for speed. Yellow accents for bigger booms, the mech had decided. Blue symbols for luck. They didn't remove everything evenly. Patches of ultramarine blue remained, showing through the crude paint job like bruises. His name, carefully inscribed in high Gothic on his sarcophagus, disappeared under layers of red paint and crude Ork glyphs. The purity seals that had adorned his chassis, each one placed there by a chaplain and blessed with prayers, were simply torn off. The Grots threw them into a pile of other useless bits, all the sacred items that meant nothing to Orks. Servo skulls that had hovered near him during battles, destroyed in the fighting at Valorin Pass, were replaced with crude Ork totems and trophies. Teeth, the currency of Ork society made from their own constantly regenerating tusks, were nailed and glued to his armor as decorations. Chains with dangling bits of scrap metal were welded on. Everything about his appearance that spoke of the Ultramarines, of Ultramar, of the Imperium, was stripped away or covered over. Through it all, Brother Castus could do nothing but witness. He had no voice to protest, no hand to strike, no way to end his own existence and deny the Orks their prize. He was a consciousness trapped in a tomb, and the tomb was being desecrated before his senses. Every scrape of the grinder sent vibrations through his chassis that his neural interface interpreted as something uncomfortably close to pain. Every splash of crude paint felt like a violation. He had served the chapter for 600 years. He had earned his rest in the sleep between battles, had earned the reverence of his brothers, had earned the right to continue serving until glorious destruction claimed him. Instead, he was becoming something monstrous. The mech eventually turned his attention to the weapons systems. Castus's assault cannon, that beautiful piece of technology that had slain so many enemies, was apparently insufficiently Orky. The big mech examined it, grunted, then started ordering its removal. The careful mounting brackets that allowed for precise targeting were cut away with welding torches. The ammunition feed system, a marvel of engineering that ensured the weapon never jammed, was ripped out. The barrel assembly came off, and for a moment, Castus dared to hope they would simply replace it with something that wouldn't work, that would fail when they tried to fire it, that would deny them the use of their prize. But mech boys, for all their crude methods, have that genetic engineering instinct. The big mech selected a massive Ork weapon, something that looked like it had been built from a dozen different guns welded together, with ammunition belts crisscrossing its surface and what might have been a flamethrower attached to the bottom. With brutal efficiency, the Orks modified Castus's weapon mount to accept this monstrosity. They didn't bother with targeting systems or fire control. They just bolted it on, rigged up a crude firing mechanism, and called it good. When they tested it, firing a burst into the ceiling of the workshop and bringing down a shower of debris that sent Gretchen scurrying for cover, it worked. Ork technology at its finest. The Power Fist proved more resistant to their modifications, simply because it was a solid piece of adamantium that even Orks couldn't easily take apart. But they could add to it. Spikes got welded onto the fingers. A buzzsaw blade was attached to the forearm. Additional armor plates, torn from some other vehicle and covered in Ork glyphs, were bolted onto the fist's housing. They even attached a small scorcher, a crude flamethrower, to the wrist. Because why not have more weapons? The elegant, brutal simplicity of the original Power Fist disappeared under layers of Ork improvements. Days passed, maybe weeks. Castus had no way to track time with his chronometer systems offline. The work continued. They opened panels in his chassis, poked around in his internal systems with Gretchen hands and mech tools, not understanding what they were looking at, but making changes anyway. They found his power source, a plasma reactor that had hummed quietly for 600 years, with minimal maintenance. The big mech stared at it for a long time, clearly recognizing that it was important, but not entirely understanding how it worked. He left it mostly intact, but added supplementary power feeds from Ork sources, just in case. These feeds were inefficient, prone to overloading, and fundamentally incompatible with Castus's systems, but the WH field would make them work regardless. The worst moment, the absolute nadir of this nightmare, came when the mech discovered the sarcophagus itself. He'd clearly been wondering what was in the armored box at the center of the chassis, and eventually curiosity overcame whatever caution he possessed. With a massive pry bar, the big mech forced open the outer casing. Castus felt the pressure on his tomb, felt the seals breaking, felt the sanctity of his final resting place being violated. His audio sensors picked up the hiss of escaping preservative fluids, felt the temperature change as the carefully controlled internal environment was exposed to the filthy air of the workshop. The Orks stared at what they found. Castus couldn't see himself, but he knew what they were looking at. What remained of his body, sustained by the sarcophagus's systems. A torso, perhaps part of his head, wrapped in neural interface cables and life support tubes. What might have once been recognizable as human, as a space marine, now reduced to biological components necessary to house the consciousness that piloted this machine. The Orks made sounds that might have been disgust, or might have been fascination. The mech reached in with a crude instrument, poking at the cables, and Castus felt it through his whole being. Not physical pain, because those nerve endings no longer existed or no longer functioned in the traditional sense, but awareness of violation, of something fundamentally wrong occurring to the most intimate part of his existence. The big mech seemed to understand, in his limited way, that the thing in the box was important. He didn't rip out the cables or smash the life support systems. Instead, he had his Gretchen clean up the spilled fluids, seal some of the gaps with crude welding, and patch the sarcophagus back together. The repairs were horrific to contemplate, all angular welds and mismatched metal, nothing like the precision work of Imperial tech marines. But they held. The systems continued functioning, kept functioning, would keep functioning for the Emperor only knew how long. Castus would not be granted even the mercy of system failure and death. He would continue, trapped, aware, as these monsters completed their work. More weapons were added. A rocket launcher, because every good Ork vehicle needs missiles, mounted on his shoulder joint, where it interfered with his chassis's rotation. Big shooters on his hips. A grabbing claw, essentially a giant mechanical hand, attached to the spot where another weapon might have gone. The mech seemed to be operating under the principle that if a spot could fit a weapon, it should have a weapon. That the systems would be impossible to use simultaneously, that the targeting would be a nightmare, that the added weight would make movement difficult. None of these concerns mattered. More Dakar, always more Dakar. The paint job continued. Layers of red, yellow and blue covered every surface. Ork glyphs, crude and angular, were painted wherever space allowed. The mech's personal symbol, marking this as his work, went on the sarcophagus itself. Teeth and chains and bits of scrap metal got attached as decoration. The Orks seemed to delight in making the Dreadnought, their Dreadnought now in their minds, look as mean and aggressive as possible. Some of the additions serve no purpose whatsoever. Metal plates welded on at odd angles, spikes pointing in directions that couldn't possibly threaten an enemy, chains that did nothing except hang there and rattle when the chassis moved. But to the Orks, all of it made sense. All of it made the machine better, tougher, killier. They even modified the base and legs, though Dreadnought locomotion systems are notoriously robust and difficult to alter. Where Castus had once walked with measured, powerful steps, now his movement would be lurching and uneven, thanks to mismatched repair work on his damaged leg joints. The Orks added armor plates to his lower limbs that actually made them heavier and slower. They welded on what appeared to be exhaust pipes that led nowhere, but would presumably belch smoke when active, because smoke makes things look tougher. Everything about the modifications demonstrated the Ork philosophy that more is better, and subtlety is for gits who can't afford more guns. Throughout this process, Brother Castus's consciousness remained trapped in his nightmare. He couldn't sleep. The hibernation systems that normally provided mercy between battles were offline or inaccessible. He was awake for every moment, every modification, every desecration. He tried to distract himself by remembering his service before the Dreadnought, his youth as a scout, learning the skills that would serve him throughout his service, his initiation into the tactical squads, his first taste of full battle brother status, the campaigns he'd fought in his living body, the brothers he'd served alongside, the victories they'd achieved in the Emperor's name. But these memories felt increasingly distant, increasingly unreal. The present overwhelmed everything. The constant noise of the workshop, the lurching in his systems every time the Orks made another modification, the helplessness. In his centuries as a Dreadnought, Castus had been powerful. He had been respected. He had been a hero, an ancient one whose counsel was sought and whose mere presence inspired. Now he was reduced to this, a toy for monsters who couldn't even comprehend what they had, a prize so thoroughly violated that he didn't know if he could ever be recovered, even if rescue came. How could he return to his brothers looking like this? How could he face them knowing he'd been made into this obscenity? He tried to hold on to his faith. The Emperor protects, the old saying went. But the Emperor had not protected him from this. He tried to remember the teachings of the Codex Astartes, that sacred text penned by his own Primarch. But the Codex said nothing about enduring conscious entombment in a defiled shell, while Orks turned you into a weapon against your own kind. He tried to think of Guilliman, that exemplar of rationality and tactical genius. What would the Primarch say about this situation? Perhaps something about accepting what cannot be changed and focusing on what can be influenced. But Castus could influence nothing. He could only endure. Time became meaningless. The workshop's cycle of work and rest, of frantic activity and periodic lulls, provided no actual measure of duration. The Orks didn't care about human concepts of hours and days. They worked when they felt like working, slept when they felt like sleeping, and stopped to eat or fight amongst themselves when the mood struck. The big mech maintained focus on his project better than his underlings, returning again and again to examine his work, to add more modifications, to bark orders at Gretchen who were installing components incorrectly. Eventually, inevitably, the work reached a state the big mech considered finished. This didn't mean everything worked perfectly. Ork construction is never perfect. There would be pieces left over that nobody could identify, parts that didn't quite fit but were forced into place anyway, systems that probably shouldn't be connected but were. None of that mattered. The big mech stood back, looked at what he'd created, and nodded with satisfaction. He'd taken Space Marine technology and made it Orky. He'd created something that would smash and blast and stomp, and everyone would know it was his creation. That was victory enough. The testing phase proved as chaotic as the construction. The Orks fired up Castus's systems, and he felt power flooding through his chassis for the first time since the battle at Valorin Pass. But everything was wrong. The power feeds were irregular, surging and dropping. The weapon systems had no proper targeting integration. The movement controls, already damaged in battle, had been modified to the point where they barely responded to his neural inputs. When they tried to make him walk, the Dreadnought lurched forward in an unsteady gait that threatened to topple it onto the watching Orks. They laughed. Of course they laughed. To them, the stumbling war machine was hilarious. They tested the weapons next, and the workshop erupted in chaos. The modified assault cannon equivalent roared to life, spewing shells in a wide arc that killed several Gretchen and sent everyone diving for cover. The rocket launcher misfired, the missile spiraling wildly before impacting a pile of scrap and causing a secondary explosion. The Scorcher worked perfectly, unfortunately, belching a gout of flame that ignited an oil spill and started a fire that took the Orks several minutes to extinguish. Through it all, Castus remained trapped in the pilot's seat of this mad creation, unable to control what his weapons did, even as they fired under Ork commands. The big mech seemed pleased with the destruction. To an Ork, weapons that caused chaos were good weapons. That they'd nearly killed the entire work crew was irrelevant. That they'd damaged the workshop was acceptable losses. The important thing was that the war machine functioned after a fashion. The mech slapped a hand against Castus's armored hull, the clang reverberating through the chassis, and declared his work complete. The looted Dreadnought would march to war. But before we follow Castus into battle, we must address the question of rescue. The Ultramarines do not abandon their own lightly. When Battle Company withdrew from Valoran Pass, the Master of the Fourth would have been counting losses. He would have noted which battle brothers failed to rejoin the force, which equipment was left behind. And he would have recorded that Brother Castus, venerable ancient of the Fourth Company, had fallen and his chassis had not been recovered. This information would have reached the chapter command quickly. The initial response would have been fury. Cold, calculated ultramarine fury directed at the Orks who had overrun their position and taken one of their ancient ones. The Orks themselves would neither know nor care about the significance, but the Ultramarines would. Immediately, resources would be diverted toward recovery operations. If Castus had fallen in a temporary defeat, if the Ultramarines had maintained control of the overall battlefield, recovery would have been swift. Drop pods would have delivered assault marines to the site within hours. Even in death, Castus would have been returned to his chapter, his remains treated with reverence, and his gene seed harvested if possible. But in this scenario, recovery proved impossible. The Orks had swept over the battlefield so thoroughly, had pushed the Ultramarines back so far that the area remained under greenskin control. Reconnaissance missions revealed thousands of Orks swarming through the forests near Valoran Pass, looting everything they could carry. Somewhere in that chaotic mass was Castus, or what remained of him. Launching a recovery operation would have meant committing substantial forces that were desperately needed to stabilize other fronts. The decision fell to the company master: attempt recovery or accept the loss. We can imagine the debate in the chapter command. The chaplains would have argued for immediate recovery, citing the sacred nature of dreadnoughts and the need to never abandon the fallen. The tech marines would have pointed out that every hour Castus remained in Ork hands increased the chances of irreversible damage to his chassis and systems. The captain would have considered tactical realities, the bigger picture of the campaign, the risk versus the potential reward. In the end, pragmatism likely won. The campaign to drive the Orks from Espandor took precedence over recovering a single fallen warrior, even one as honored as Brother Castus. The decision was made to continue the larger battle and attempt recovery once strategic situation stabilized. But stabilization took longer than anyone expected. The Orks proved resilient, numerous, and unwilling to give up their prize world. Weeks turned into months. The Ultramarines achieved victories, pushed the Orks back from major population centers, protected the critical infrastructure that makes a world valuable to the Imperium. But the greenskins remained on Espandor, dug into remote regions, constantly reinforced by new warbands arriving from other systems. The window for quick recovery closed. The chances of finding Castus, let alone recovering him intact, diminished to nearly nothing. Unknown to the Ultramarines, their brother was undergoing his transformation not in some remote forest camp where mobile Orks might have dragged him, but in a more permanent settlement. The Ork presence on Espandor had grown substantial enough that mechs had established proper workshops. These crude facilities weren't going anywhere quickly, but tracking them through the vast forests proved nearly impossible without committing overwhelming reconnaissance resources. The Ultramarines searched. Every patrol kept sensors active for signs of Dreadnought power signatures. Every interrogation of captured Orks included questions about looted Space Marine equipment. But Orks are notoriously unreliable sources of information, even when they cooperate, which they rarely do. There was one near miss. A strike force of scouts, infiltrating deep into Ork-held territory, detected a power signature consistent with a Dreadnought reactor. They called in support, and a full company moved to the location. The raid hit the Ork workshop with devastating precision. Dozens of Orks died in the first minutes. The workshop burned. But when the Ultramarines searched the ruins, they found only pieces of a looted Imperial Guard Sentinel, its power cell registering similar energy outputs to their target. Castus was elsewhere, his signature masked by the hundreds of engines and generators in the Ork settlement, or simply missed in the vast expanse of territory to search. The psychological impact on the chapter cannot be understated. Every Space Marine knows that death can come at any moment. They accept this, they train for it, they welcome it, in a sense, as proof that they died doing their duty. But this was different. One of their ancient ones, a hero who had already sacrificed so much, was out there somewhere, possibly still alive and trapped in his sarcophagus. The chaplains held services of remembrance, but they couldn't offer the finality that death would provide. Brother Castus existed in a state of uncertainty, neither confirmed dead nor successfully recovered. It gnawed at the chapter's collective consciousness. The Fourth Company maintained the hunt even as they fought other battles. Every operation in Ork-controlled areas included secondary objectives to locate Castus or gather intelligence on his whereabouts. Marines swore personal oaths to bring their ancient one home. The Tech Marines prepared for the worst, readying the tools and replacement parts that would be needed to restore him if recovery proved successful. The chapter serfs prepared the sacred oils and incense that would be used in reconsecration ceremonies. Everyone held on to hope, though that hope diminished with each passing week. Meanwhile, Castus experienced something close to despair. He had heard nothing from his chapter. He couldn't know that they were searching for him, that they hadn't forgotten, that the entire Fourth Company considered his recovery a matter of honor. From his perspective, trapped in silence with no communication capabilities, he had been abandoned. Lost to the chapter. Forgotten in the chaos of war. The thought hurt worse than the physical modifications the Orks had inflicted. He had served for 600 years. He had given everything to the Ultramarines, and now he would spend whatever time remained to him as this mockery, this abomination, this thing the Orks had created. He contemplated ending his own existence. If his life support systems could be sabotaged, if the reactor could be overloaded, if any of a dozen catastrophic failures could be induced, he might achieve the death that battle had denied him. But he had no control. The Orks had disabled everything, rewired everything. Even his limited ability to influence his own systems was gone. He was purely passenger now, consciousness inhabiting a machine he could not command. The only mercy was that when they powered down his systems between modifications, when his consciousness faded into dormancy, he found something resembling peace. But the Orks never left him dormant for long. There was always more work to do, more testing to conduct, more modifications to try. Finally, the day came when the big mech declared it was time to see his creation in battle. The WAG was moving to a new battlefield, a major push against one of Espandor's fortress cities. Every available unit was being mobilized, and the mech wanted his looted Dreadnought there to show the other mechs what he'd accomplished. Castus was loaded onto a crude transport, essentially a flatbed truck with additional armor plates welded on. Other Orks piled onto the vehicle around him, hanging off the sides, standing on his chassis, treating him as mobile cover. The transport roared to life with a cloud of black exhaust and lurched toward the battle. The journey provided Castus his first view of the outside world in however long his captivity had lasted. His optical senses, partially restored during the modification process, showed him the landscape of Espandor. The forests he remembered, now torn and damaged by Ork presence. Trees knocked down to clear paths for vehicles. Crude structures built from salvaged materials and loot. Everywhere, Orks. Thousands of them, streaming toward the battle in a great green migration. They rode in vehicles of every description, from nimble buggies to massive battle wagons. They flew overhead in ramshackle aircraft that belched smoke and fire. The scale of the WAG was stunning. No wonder the Ultramarines had struggled to contain this invasion. As they approached the battle zone, the sounds of war grew louder. The thunder of artillery, the crack of small arms fire, the distinctive bark of bolters. The Ultramarines were here, defending this city against the green tide, and Castus was being brought to fight against them. The horror of his situation crystallized in that moment. He would be deployed as a weapon against his own brothers. The Orks would activate his systems, would use his guns to shoot at Ultramarines, would send him shambling across the battlefield toward the very warriors who had once looked to him for guidance and inspiration. He tried to find some way to warn them, any method of communication. If he could just activate a distress beacon, send out a signal on Ultramarine frequencies, let them know that he was here and hostile, that they should destroy him rather than attempt capture or disabling. But again, he had no control. His communication systems remained locked down or had been rewired so extensively that they no longer functioned as intended. He was silent, helpless, a ghost in his own machine. The transport crashed through the final tree line and emerged onto the battlefield. The fortress city of Helion spread before them, its walls scarred but intact, its towers bristling with defensive weapons. And on those walls, in blue and gold armor, stood Ultramarines. Castus recognized the markings of the Fourth Company. His company, brothers he had fought beside, advised, protected. They were here, and he was out here, on the wrong side of this battle. The transport stopped, and the Orks began piling off, eager for the fight. The big mech approached Castus's chassis and activated the control systems he'd rigged up, overriding whatever remained of the original controls. Power flooded through Castus's body. Weapons came online. The modified assault cannon hummed with readiness. The rocket launcher's targeting systems, crude as they were, began scanning for targets. And the locomotion systems engaged, forcing his legs to move, forcing his chassis to turn toward the enemy, toward his brothers. The Orks were screaming with joy, firing their guns in the air, charging forward. And in the middle of them, lurching along on damaged legs, painted in Ork colors and bristling with crude weapons, came the thing that had once been Brother Castus, venerable ancient of the Fourth Company, now just another piece of looted war gear. The Ultramarines saw him coming. They couldn't have missed him. A Dreadnought-sized target, even one modified beyond recognition, draws attention on any battlefield. Through his sensors, Castus watched as battle brothers adjusted their aim, targeted him specifically. Part of him desperately wanted them to fire, to put him down, to end this nightmare. But he also knew they would hesitate. They would wonder if one of their ancient ones could possibly be inside. They would want to disable rather than destroy, to capture rather than kill. That hesitation, that mercy, would cost them. The big mech activated the weapons. The modified assault cannon roared, spewing shells in the general direction of the Ultramarine lines. The accuracy was terrible, nothing like the precision Castus had once achieved. But volume of fire mattered more to Orks than accuracy. Some of the shells found targets, impacting on the fortress walls, on defensive positions, possibly on the Marines themselves. The rocket launcher fired next, its missiles spiraling through the air before impacting somewhere in the city. Castus felt every shot like a betrayal, like he was personally pulling the trigger, even though he had no control whatsoever. The return fire came quickly. Bolter rounds pinged off his armor. Lascannon shots scorched deep furrows in his chassis. A missile struck his right side, the explosion rocking his entire frame and taking several orcs near him with it. But the modifications, for all their crudeness, had actually added mass and armor. The orcs' additional plating, welded on without any real system, provided extra protection through sheer bulk. And the WH40K field helped. It always helped. The shells that should have penetrated found their energy dispersed. The systems that should have failed kept functioning. Orc belief made their creation resilient. Brother Castus watched his brothers through sensors that showed them only as tactical contacts, potential targets that the crude fire control systems kept highlighting. He knew some of them would be warriors he'd fought beside in his living days, centuries ago. Others would be younger Marines who had grown up hearing stories about ancient Castus, learning from recordings of his council. All of them would be devastated to learn what had happened to him. If he could just override the systems, just take control for a moment, he could turn his weapons on the orcs around him. He could destroy himself in a way that took as many greenskins as possible with him. He could die as an Ultramarine should, but his consciousness remained separated from control, a passenger viewing his own actions with horror. The Dreadnought lurched forward, closing the distance to the Ultramarine positions. Orc boys used him as cover, hiding behind his bulk as they advanced. The big mech stayed close, one hand on the control mechanism, directing his creation like a puppeteer. When they got close enough, the melee weapons engaged. The Power Fist, still functional beneath its orc modifications, swung at a defensive barrier. The impact shattered Ferrocrete and killed an Imperial Guard trooper who had been taking cover there. The buzzsaw, attached to his forearm by orc ingenuity, screamed to life and bit into another defensive position. This was hell. This was worse than death. Castus had imagined many ends for himself, destroyed by a lucky shot from a powerful enemy, worn down over millennia until his systems finally failed, even catastrophic destruction that vaporized him in an instant. All of those would have been preferable to this, to be used as a weapon against the Imperium, against Ultramar, against his own chapter. To have his very existence, his 600 years of service, twisted into this obscenity. He would have wept if he still possessed the biological capability for tears. The battle raged for hours. The orcs threw themselves at the Helian defenses with typical disregard for casualties. They died by the thousands, their bodies piling up in front of the walls. But thousands more kept coming. Castus remained in the thick of it, an unwilling participant in the slaughter. His weapons fired when the mechs commanded. His fists struck when the orcs steered him into melee. Several times, Ultramarine fire found critical spots, damaged components, caused system failures. Each time, Gretchen swarmed over him, performing field repairs with whatever materials they had on hand. Scrap metal got welded over breaches. Duct tape, actual duct tape, held together systems that should have required precision maintenance, and it worked. The WH field and orc belief kept him in the fight. Then came the moment that would haunt whatever remained of his consciousness. An Ultramarine assault squad deployed from the walls, jump pack troops coming down behind the orc lines to disrupt their advance. They targeted the looted Dreadnought specifically, correctly identifying it as a major threat and possibly recognizing it as one of their own. The sergeant leading them landed directly in front of Castus, his power fist crackling with energy. For just a moment, they were face to face, or as close as a Dreadnought and a Marine can be. The sergeant paused, just a fraction of a second, and Castus saw recognition in that pause. This Marine knew. He suspected. The marking might have been covered, but the basic chassis shape, the size, something gave it away. The sergeant's hesitation cost him. The big mech activated Castus's power fist before the Marine could strike. The blow caught the sergeant in his side, the force of it shattering ceramite armor and crushing the flesh beneath. The Ultramarine fell, and his battle brothers descended in fury on the Dreadnought that had struck him down. But it was too late. The damage was done. Castus had struck down a son of Ultramar, not intentionally, not willingly, but his body, his frame, his weapon had dealt the killing blow. Inside his sarcophagus, in the darkness that housed what remained of his biological form, something broke. Some final thread of hope, or resistance, or sanity simply gave way. The assault marines damaged Castus severely in their vengeance. They tore off his rocket launcher, ripped apart his secondary weapons, damaged his locomotion systems to the point where his left leg barely functioned. But they didn't destroy him completely. Either their ammunition ran low, or reinforcements forced them to withdraw, or some other tactical consideration pulled them back. The big mech managed to extract his creation from the immediate combat zone, dragging the broken Dreadnought back toward Ork lines. Castus's systems were failing. His consciousness flickered. And finally, mercy came in the form of forced hibernation, as his damaged systems could no longer sustain full awareness. The darkness took him, and in that darkness, he found strange comfort. If he could not die, at least he could sleep. At least he could not witness what his body was being used for. At least there could be periods where awareness ceased and the nightmare temporarily ended. He prayed to the Emperor, or to Guilliman, or to whatever force might hear the prayers of the damned, that the Ultramarines would find him before the Orks repaired him. That his brothers would show him mercy, even if it meant destroying his chassis completely. That someone, anyone, would end this existence that had ceased to be service and had become only suffering. In the aftermath of the battle, the Ultramarines recovered their fallen brother, the sergeant who had been struck down. His body was retrieved with full honors, his gene seed harvested to create future warriors. During the recovery operation, the apothecaries found traces of ceramite on his armor that didn't match any Ork weapon, traces that were consistent with Dreadnought armor. The realization spread through the Fourth Company like a shadow. One of their ancient ones was out there, in Ork hands, being used against them. The hunt for Brother Castus took on new urgency. This was no longer just about recovering lost equipment or honoring the fallen. It was about ending the suffering of one of their own, whatever form that ending had to take. The tragic irony is that both sides now wanted essentially the same thing, though for different reasons. The Ultramarines wanted to find Castus to end his torment and deny the Orks their weapon. The Orks wanted to keep their prized, looted Dreadnought functioning and bring it back into battle. The difference was that the Orks had possession and the Ultramarines had only determination. In the vast forests and contested territories of Espandor, in the chaos of ongoing battles and constant Ork movement, actually locating one specific war machine proved almost impossible. Brother Castus's consciousness remained in hibernation for an unknown period. Days, weeks, possibly longer. When awareness returned, it came slowly and painfully. His systems had been repaired again, though how extensively he couldn't immediately determine. He was in a different location, not the workshop where he'd been modified, but some kind of forward position. The sounds around him suggested an active war zone, and his power systems were coming online, which meant the Orks were preparing to deploy him again. The nightmare was not over. It might never be over. If there is an ending to this story, it likely comes in one of several forms, none of them pleasant. Perhaps the Ultramarines finally locate the Ork settlement where Castus is being held. They deploy overwhelming force, willing to accept casualties they would normally avoid, driven by the absolute necessity of recovering their brother. The strike is surgical and devastating. The Orks die to the last before they can mount serious resistance. And in the ruins of the workshop, the Ultramarines find him. The Tech Marines examine what the Orks have done, their expressions unreadable behind their helmets. The chaplain approaches and places a hand on the defiled chassis, and with sorrow deeper than oceans, the chaplain gives the order. Brother Castus is granted the Emperor's peace. His reactor is shut down cleanly. His consciousness fades not into forced hibernation, but into true rest. His gene seed, miraculously still viable within the sarcophagus, is harvested, and what remains of his chassis is given full funeral rites, every Ork modification removed, the sacred blue and gold restored, before his honored remains are interred in the chapter's halls of remembrance. Or perhaps the ending is more brutal. Castus is deployed in battle again and again, each time fighting against Imperial forces. The Orks use him until his systems fail, beyond even their ability to repair. The power core finally gives out, or the life support systems break down, or accumulated damage reaches a point where no amount of mech tinkering can restore function. In this scenario, Castus dies among Orks, used as a weapon against everything he fought for, his final moments spent in the service of the Greenskins. The Orks, pragmatic as ever, strip his chassis for parts and move on to the next battle. Brother Castus becomes just another casualty of the long war, his fate unknown to his chapter, his name eventually fading from memory as centuries pass and new heroes rise to take his place. There is a third possibility, perhaps the darkest. The campaign on Espandor ends without Castus being recovered. The Ultramarines drive the Orks off-world through attrition, superior tactics, and the eventual arrival of reinforcements. But some Orks escape, taking their loot with them, and among that loot is one heavily modified Dreadnought. He ends up in the hands of a freebooter warband, mercenary Orks who travel between conflicts. For years, decades, perhaps centuries, Castus is dragged across the galaxy, fighting in battles on worlds he's never heard of, against enemies that mean nothing to him. He becomes a legend among certain Ork groups, the Ultramarine Stomper, or some equally crude name. The Ultramarines hear rumors of him occasionally, scattered reports from other chapters or Imperial forces who faced a looted Dreadnought bearing traces of Ultramarine colors. But he's always gone before they can respond, moved by the chaotic nature of Ork warfare to the next battle, the next world, the next horror. In any of these scenarios, the fundamental tragedy remains the same. Brother Castus, who served the Ultramarines with honor for 6 centuries, who survived wounds that would have killed lesser Marines, who was preserved in the sacred form of a Dreadnought to continue that service, ends up as a victim of the most profound violation imaginable. He becomes a weapon wielded against everything he fought for, transformed from hero to horror, not through any choice of his own, but through the simple bad fortune of falling into Ork hands. This raises uncomfortable questions that the Imperium rarely addresses. What are the ethical implications of Dreadnought technology? The interred warriors are told they're being honored, that they'll continue serving the Emperor. And this is true, to an extent, but they're also being trapped in a half-life of endless warfare with no genuine rest, no peace, only the periods of forced hibernation between battles. When a Dreadnought pilot falls into enemy hands, as sometimes happens despite all precautions, the suffering that results is beyond what most can imagine. The pilot remains aware, remains conscious, throughout whatever horrors their captors inflict. For a warrior culture that values death in battle as the ultimate service, this immortality becomes a curse. The Ultramarines would never speak of this publicly. Such discussions would undermine the honor of the Dreadnought ritual, would make future candidates hesitate before accepting interment. But in the privacy of chapter councils, in the quiet moments when chaplains and apothecaries discuss the fates of their warriors, these concerns must exist. How many ancient ones have suffered similar fates over the 10 millennia since the Horus heresy? How many remain in captivity, their consciousness trapped in shells used by the enemies of mankind? How many have endured torments far worse than death because their chapters valued their experience too much to let them rest? For the individual Orks involved, none of this matters. The big mech who modified Castus probably never gave a thought to the consciousness inside the machine. To him, it was just an interesting mechanical puzzle, a chance to show off his skills and create something impressive. The Gretchen who helped with the work saw it as just another task, no different from maintaining a looted tank or building a new chopper. The war boss who deployed the modified Dreadnought in battle cared only about its effectiveness as a weapon, that it had once been a hero of the Imperium, that it contained a suffering soul, that its very existence represented a profound tragedy. None of this registered in the Ork psyche. They saw only a valuable piece of loot that could kill things and that made their warband stronger. This fundamental disconnect between how the two sides view technology and war makes the tragedy more complete. To the Ultramarines, a Dreadnought is a reliquary, a shrine, a brother given eternal life to continue his service. To the Orks, it's just a fancy weapon platform that happens to have better construction than their usual vehicles. They don't desecrate it out of malice or desire to inflict suffering. They modify it the same way they modify everything else they capture, with no awareness of the sanctity they're violating or the pain they're causing. The horror is accidental, which somehow makes it worse. The question of whether anything could be done to prevent such scenarios reveals the limitations of both cultures. The Ultramarines could destroy their dreadnoughts before allowing them to fall into enemy hands, but this runs counter to their entire philosophy of preservation and honor. It would mean killing their ancient ones rather than risking capture, turning what should be a glorious fate into a conditional one dependent on tactical circumstances. The alternative would be to abandon the dreadnought tradition entirely, to simply grant the Emperor's peace to mortally wounded Marines, rather than preserving them in mechanical bodies. But this would deprive the chapter of invaluable experience and tactical wisdom, of living links to their history, of heroes who can continue serving for millennia. From the Ork perspective, preventing this specific horror would require them to fundamentally change their nature, which is impossible. Orks loot. It's what they do. Asking them not to take valuable equipment from battlefields would be like asking water not to flow downhill. Even if an individual Ork could be made to understand the suffering they were causing, which is doubtful given their psychological makeup, they would still take the equipment because the instinct to loot is stronger than any moral consideration could be. The WAG field that makes their technology work is also the force that drives them to acquire more technology. The two aspects are inseparable. As we conclude this examination of a nightmare scenario playing out on the worlds of Ultramar, we must acknowledge that such events, while perhaps not common, are also not unique. Somewhere in the galaxy right now, other dreadnoughts are suffering similar fates. Orks are not the only ones who capture Space Marine equipment. Chaos warbands do so, and conduct rituals of corruption and desecration, far more deliberately cruel than anything Orks manage through simple ignorance. Dark Eldar might capture a dreadnought and keep its pilot alive indefinitely for their amusement, inflicting torments that make Ork modifications seem merciful by comparison. Even Necrons might take interest in the combination of living tissue and machine, conducting experiments that violate the very concept of consciousness. For the Ultramarines specifically, each such loss reminds them that even their ordered, disciplined approach to warfare cannot prevent all tragedies. Guilliman's Codex Astartes provides tactics and strategies for nearly every situation, but it cannot account for the chaos of the galaxy, the sheer weight of numbers that enemies can bring, the simple bad luck that sometimes puts a revered warrior in an impossible situation. The sons of Ultramar pride themselves on their ability to adapt, to overcome, to find solutions where none seem to exist. But some problems have no good solutions. Some losses cannot be recovered. Some brothers cannot be saved. The warriors of the Fourth Company who fought alongside Brother Castus before his fall, who searched for him after his capture, who continue hoping for either his rescue or at least the recovery of his remains, they carry this burden with them. Every battle against Orks holds the possibility of encountering their lost brother. Every looted vehicle they destroy could theoretically have been him. Every victory feels incomplete because one of their ancient ones remains unaccounted for. The chapter will not forget. The Ultramarines never forget their fallen. But memory, honor, and determination cannot always overcome the brutal realities of warfare in the 41st millennium. If there is any meaning to be found in this tragedy, it lies in the reminder of what the Imperium fights for. The galaxy is full of horrors. The enemies of mankind are countless, varied, and often incomprehensible in their motives and methods. Orks are perhaps the most straightforward of these enemies, lacking the malevolent intelligence of chaos or the predatory cruelty of Dark Eldar. But even straightforward enemies can inflict profound suffering through their simple nature. The Orks don't need to understand what they're doing to a Dreadnought pilot to make it a horror. The violation of something sacred, the transformation of a hero into a mockery of everything they stood for. These things happen simply because Orks are what they are and do what they do. This is why the Imperium fights. Not just to conquer and expand, not just to enforce the Emperor's will across the stars, but to protect humanity from fates like this. Every world that falls to Orks becomes a nightmare for its inhabitants. Every battle lost means more suffering, more violation, more transformation of order into chaos. The Ultramarines, standing as they do on the edge of civilized space, manning the borders of Ultramar against all threats, understand this better than most. They fight not just for glory or duty, though both matter, but because the alternative is unthinkable. Behind them lie worlds where citizens can live decent lives, where justice prevails, where the Imperium's promise of protection is actually fulfilled. Before them lies the darkness that would consume all of this given the chance. So the battle continues. The Fourth Company prosecutes the war against the Orks on Espandor with renewed determination. Every mech workshop destroyed is a small victory. Every Ork warlord slain weakens the WH40K. Every recovered piece of looted equipment is one less weapon in enemy hands. And always, in the back of every Ultramarine's mind, is the knowledge that one of their own is out there somewhere, suffering in ways that honor cannot ease and duty cannot prevent. They fight harder because of this. They push deeper into enemy territory. They take risks they might otherwise avoid. Because Brother Castus, venerable, ancient of the Ultramarines, deserves better than this. He deserves either rescue or rest, and until one of those is achieved, the chapter will not relent. Such is the grim reality of warfare in the 41st millennium. Such are the costs of standing against the darkness. And such is the fate that befalls those unlucky enough to fall into the hands of the Orks when serving the Imperium of man. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and sometimes there are fates worse than death. For Brother Castus and others like him, they have learned this truth in the most personal and horrifying way possible. They have become living testaments to the cruelty of the galaxy, to the sufferings that can be inflicted without malice, to the violations that occur when sacred things fall into profane hands. We remember them. We honor their sacrifice, even as we acknowledge the horror of what they endure. And we understand that in a galaxy of endless war, such tragedies will continue to unfold, whether we wish them to or not. The only response is to fight harder, to never give up the search for the lost, to grant mercy where mercy can be given, and to ensure that such fates are avenged even if they cannot be prevented. This is the way of the Ultramarines. This is the burden they carry. And this is the price of war in the grim darkness of the far future. If you enjoyed this deep exploration into the dark corners of Warhammer lore, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that like button. Share your thoughts in the comments about this scenario and what you think should be the fate of captured dreadnoughts. Until next time, stay vigilant, and remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war.